At 30, he held the entire world in his hands. At 32, he lay on his deathbed with a final command that ignited 40 years of bloody civil war. Alexander didn't just conquer empires, he incinerated their future with only 3 final words. Could a wild horse reveal the destiny of a future king? In the rugged wine-swept court of Macedonia, young Alexander was not merely raised. He was forged in the crucible of dual influences that would define his reign: the martial, ruthless pragmatism of his father, King Philip II, and the expansive philosophical inquiry of his tutor Aristotle. The Macedonian court was a dangerous viper's nest of polygamy, assassination plots, and shifting alliances. Yet it was here that Philip was busy turning his nation from a backwater state of goat herders into a regional hegemon. He entrusted the intellectual cultivation of his heir to Aristotle, the greatest mind of the Greek world, ensuring that Alexander possessed not just the muscle to conquer, but the mind to govern, the logic to analyze logistics, and the imagination to envision a world beyond the horizon. The defining moment of this precocious youth, a story echoed through millennia, emerged in the dust of the royal stables when he encountered Bucephalus, a massive, furious steed that had thrown off every veteran handler who dared approach it. The horse, a magnificent black stallion with a massive head, was a beast of immense power and value, costing a staggering 13 talents, a sum that could pay the wages of 1,500 soldiers for a month, but it was deemed unrideable. While Philip and his generals dismissed the animal as useless, the young prince, observing with the sharp eye of a natural tactician, noticed what the adults had missed. The horse was not vicious. He was terrified of his own shadow dancing on the ground. By gently turning Bucephalus toward the sun, eliminating the shadow that haunted the creature, Alexander mounted the animal and broke him to his will, a feat of empathy and dominance that silenced the jeering crowd. It was in this moment that Philip, witnessing the impossible, wept, not out of joy but out of a terrifying realization of scale, telling his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions, for Macedonia is too small for you." This was not just fatherly pride. It was a prophecy that would drive the boy to burn the map of the known world and rewrite it in his own image, carrying the weight of his father's expectations and his own divine belief every step of the way. Before the son could conquer the world, the father had to build the weapon that would make it possible, and the transformation of the Macedonian army under King Philip II remains one of the most significant military revolutions in human history. Philip took a kingdom of shepherds and farmers, men who were traditionally bullied by the sophisticated city-states of the south like Thebes and Athens, and the barbarian tribes of the north, and drilled them into a professional, cohesive war machine that operated with the precision of a single organism. His genius lay in the introduction of the sarissa, a terrifying 18-foot pike made of cornel wood that replaced the shorter Greek dory. This massive weapon, weighing over 5 kilograms and requiring 2 hands to wield, allowed the Macedonian phalanx to strike their enemies long before they could even close the distance, creating a bristling forest of spear points that no traditional infantry could penetrate. This formation required immense discipline and physical strength, as the soldiers in the back rows had to keep their pikes elevated to deflect incoming arrows, while the front rows created an impenetrable wall of death. But Philip's innovation wasn't just the anvil of the phalanx. It was the coordination with the hammer of the companion cavalry heteroi. The aristocrats he united under his banner to deliver the killing blow, while the infantry pinned the enemy in place. This combined arms approach changed the geometry of warfare forever. It was a system of total integration where infantry, cavalry, and light skirmishers supported one another. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, it was this very machine that crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, wiping out the legendary Sacred Band of Thebes and ending Greek independence. This victory handed the young Alexander not just a crown, but the keys to the most lethal military force the Mediterranean had ever seen. A force that was now bloodied. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience. But these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive and ready to look toward the vast riches of Persia. A wedding feast intended to celebrate the consolidation of power turned into a bloodbath that instantaneously shifted the trajectory of the ancient world. In 336 BC, when Philip II was assassinated by Pausanias, one of his own 7 bodyguards, in the theater at Aigai, the murder sent shockwaves through the chaotic political landscape of Macedonia. The motive remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it a lover's quarrel involving sexual abuse by the uncle of Philip's new wife, a plot by the spurned Queen Olympias who feared for Alexander's succession, or a Persian conspiracy? Regardless of the cause, the result was that 20-year-old Alexander faced the immediate threat of total collapse. The vultures were circling. Greek city-states, like Athens and Thebes, were already celebrating the tyrant's death, declaring liberty from Macedonian rule, and barbarian tribes on the Illyrian borders were preparing to invade. They had severely underestimated the ruthlessness of the new king. Alexander did not hesitate to mourn. Instead, he acted with a terrifying, cold efficiency that would become his hallmark. He immediately ordered the execution of all potential rivals to the throne, including his own cousin Amyntas and to princes of Lyncestis, ensuring no alternate bloodline could challenge him. When Thebes, a major Greek power, rose in revolt, believing the rumor that Alexander had died in battle against the barbarians, he marched his army south with such impossible speed, covering nearly 500 kilometers in 2 weeks, that he arrived outside their gates before they knew he had left the north. To set a permanent example that would echo through the minds of every Greek politician, Alexander did not just defeat Thebes, he annihilated it. He slaughtered 6,000 defenders, enslaved the remaining 30,000 survivors, and systematically burned the city to the ground, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. This was a message written in blood. The era of Philip was over, and the era of Alexander would tolerate no dissent. He threw a spear into Asian soil and claimed it as a gift from the gods, a theatrical and legally binding act of war that signaled the beginning of the greatest invasion in history. Leading his army of roughly 40,000 men across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, Alexander was not just launching a military campaign. He was launching a war of vengeance for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half prior, positioning himself as the champion of Hellenism. Upon landing, he stopped at the ruins of Troy to pay homage to his hero Achilles, running naked around the tomb to link his destiny with the mythic past, and reportedly taking the shield of Achilles from the temple to carry into battle. His first real test came at the Granicus River, where the local Persian satraps had gathered their forces on the steep opposite bank, hoping to stop the invasion before it truly began. They had the high ground and the river as a barrier. Against the advice of his cautious, veteran General Parmenion, who suggested waiting for dawn to outmaneuver the enemy, Alexander launched an immediate, reckless assault across the river in the late afternoon. He plunged into the water, leading the charge uphill into the teeth of the Persian cavalry. It was a chaotic melee where strategy dissolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Alexander, conspicuous in his plumed helmet and royal armor, was nearly killed when a Persian noble named Spithridates raised an axe to split his skull. He was saved at the last microsecond by Black Cletus, who severed the attacker's arm, saving the king's life. This near-death experience and the subsequent victory did more than just secure a beachhead. It cemented his status among his men as a warrior king who would bleed with them, fight in the front lines, and risk everything for glory, creating a fanatical loyalty that would carry them to the ends of the earth. How do you solve an impossible puzzle? You break the rules. As Alexander pushed deeper into Anatolia, securing coastal cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus to neutralize the Persian navy. By denying them ports, he arrived at the ancient city of Gordium in Phrygia, In the center of the city stood an ox cart, tied to a post with the legendary Gordian knot, an intricate, gnarled mass of cornel bark rope that had baffled men for generations. The knot had no visible ends, and the local legend was potent and seductive. Whoever could untie this knot was destined to become the ruler of all Asia. Alexander, acutely aware of the power of symbols and propaganda, examined the knot closely. He knew that failing to untie it would look like a bad omen to his superstitious troops and the local populace. A lesser man might have walked away or spent days picking at the fibers in futility, risking humiliation. But Alexander, in a moment of lateral thinking that perfectly encapsulated his approach to both war and politics, realized the prophecy didn't specify how the knot had to be loosened. Drawing his sword, he reportedly exclaimed, "What matters it how it is loosed?" and sliced the knot in half with a single violent stroke. He then unhitched the cart, claiming the prophecy was fulfilled. That night, a thunderstorm raged, which Alexander and his seers interpreted as Zeus approving his solution. This moment was not merely a solution to a puzzle. It was a psychological declaration to the world that the conquest of Asia would not be achieved through diplomacy, patience, or following the established rules of the game, but through the edge of the sword and the force of his own will. Two kings met on the battlefield, but only one would stand his ground when the fate of the known world hung in the balance. At Issus, near the border of modern-day Turkey and Syria, Alexander finally came face to face with the great king Darius III in 333 BC. Darius had mobilized a massive imperial army that vastly outnumbered the Macedonian forces, bringing with him the entire royal retinue, his family, and his treasury, as if attending a spectator sport rather than a war. However, Darius had made a critical tactical error. Impatient with Alexander's delays due to illness, he had moved his massive army behind Alexander's lines into a narrow coastal plain, bounded by the mountains and the sea. This terrain neutralized the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Persian infantry and cavalry, preventing them from enveloping the smaller Macedonian force. Alexander, identifying the weakness in the Persian disposition, deployed his phalanx to hold the center against the Greek mercenaries in Persian service, and led his companion cavalry in a shattering wedge formation on the right wing. He smashed through the Persian line, rolling up their flank, and then wheeled directly toward the chariot of the great king himself. The sight of Alexander, eyes blazing and intent on personal combat, charging through the dust and blood, broke Darius's nerve. The ruler of the largest empire on earth turned his chariot and fled in panic, leaving his army to collapse. In his haste, Darius left behind his mother, wife, and children to be captured by Alexander. This victory shattered the aura of Persian invincibility and placed the royal treasury and family in Alexander's hands. Alexander treated the royal women with unexpected chivalry, promising to maintain their status, which further bolstered his image as a civilized king. But the battle shifted the dynamic from a punitive expedition to a war of total conquest. They said the island city was impenetrable, so he moved the ocean. The siege of Tyre in 330 BC stands as a brutal testament to Alexander's engineering genius and his absolute refusal to accept no for an answer. Tyre was a crucial strategic port, secure on an island half a kilometer from the mainland with walls soaring 50 meters high. When the Tyrians refused him entry to sacrifice to their god Melkart, effectively denying his authority, Alexander could not leave such a powerful naval base behind him to threaten his supply lines. Realizing he had no navy to challenge their control of the sea, Alexander undertook one of the most ambitious construction projects of antiquity, building a massive mole, or causeway out of stone timber and rubble stretching from the shore all the way to the island's walls. For 7 grueling months, his men worked under a hail of arrows, fire ships, and divers attacking from below. The Tyrians fought with ingenuity, dropping cauldrons of red-hot sand on the attackers, which burned through armor and flesh, and constructing boom chains to block the harbor. But Alexander was relentless. He gathered a fleet from his new allies in Cyprus and Phoenicia to blockade the harbor, turning the naval siege into a land battle. When the causeway finally reached the walls, and the battering rams breached the defenses, the end was inevitable and terrifying. Furious at the city's stubborn defiance and the time lost, Alexander unleashed a slaughter of biblical proportions. His men killed 8,000 defenders in the streets, and Alexander ordered 2,000 military-age men to be crucified along the beach. He sold 30,000 women and children into slavery, sending a chilling message to every other city in the Levant that resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. He entered as a conqueror, but was worshipped as a living god. After the brutality of Tyre and the difficult siege of Gaza, where he was wounded in the shoulder, Alexander's rival in Egypt was met not with swords, but with open arms. The Egyptians, weary of Persian disrespect for their traditions and temples the Persians had notably slaughtered, the sacred Apis bull hailed him as a liberator. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, taking on the titles and responsibilities of the Egyptian kings. But political power was not enough for Alexander. He sought a spiritual validation that would elevate him above the realm of mortal men. He undertook a dangerous, mystical journey across the scorching hostility of the Libyan desert to the remote oracle of Siwa, an ancient site revered by both Greeks and Egyptians. The journey itself was mythologized, with stories of ravens guiding the army when they got lost in sandstorms and rain falling miraculously to quench their thirst. There, in the silence of the oasis, the high priest greeted him. According to some accounts, the priest intended to say, "Oh, my son," Padian in Greek, but stumbled and said, "Oh, Son of God, Pi Dios." Whether this was a linguistic error or a calculated divine revelation, Alexander embraced it wholeheartedly. He insisted that only he hear the oracle's words, and he never revealed exactly what was said. But he emerged changed. This moment marked a profound psychological turning point. He began to genuinely believe in his own divine origin, convinced he was the son of Zeus Ammon, not just Philip. This conviction fueled his boundless confidence, but also began to alienate his Macedonian veterans, who viewed this shift from a king among equals, a first among men, to a living deity, with growing suspicion, resentment, and fear that their king was becoming a tyrant. On the dusty plains of Gaugamela in 331 BC, the Persian Empire took its final, gasping breath. This was the ultimate showdown, the battle that Darius III had meticulously prepared for. He had chosen a wide, flat plain near Erbil in modern Iraq to maximize the effectiveness of his feared Sith. Chariots, with blades attached to the wheels, and his overwhelming numbers, which some sources claim reached into the hundreds of thousands. He had even flattened the ground to ensure his chariots had a smooth run. Darius was determined to crush the upstart Macedonian. Once and for all, on the night before the battle, a lunar eclipse occurred, which the Persian magi interpreted as a bad omen, shaking the morale of Darius's troops. Alexander, however, displayed a tactical brilliance that is still studied in military academies today. He deployed his troops in a unique echelon formation, holding back reserves to prevent being outflanked by the longer Persian line, a box formation that could fight in any direction. As the battle raged, Alexander noticed that as the Persian cavalry moved to flank him, they created a gap in their own line. Seeing the opening, Alexander formed his companions into a giant wedge and led a decisive charge straight into the heart of the Persian formation, once again targeting Darius directly. The ferocity of the attack, combined with the dust and chaos, panicked Darius, who fled for a second, final time, causing his army to crumble. The victory was absolute. Alexander marched into Babylon and Susa, capturing unimaginable wealth, thousands of talents of gold that would disrupt the economy of the Mediterranean. But the campaign's climax was marked by a controversial act of destruction at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. Whether in a drunken rage spurred by the courtesan ties during a victory feast, or as a calculated act of political vengeance for the burning of Athens by Xerxes, Alexander ordered the magnificent palace complex burned to the ground. The flames of Persepolis signaled the definitive end of the Achaemenid dynasty and the irrevocable rise of a new, Hellenistic world order. The map ran out, but the war did not. With Darius eventually found dead, betrayed and murdered by his own satrap Bessus, Alexander assumed the role of the avenger of the Persian king, giving Darius a royal funeral. He then pushed his exhausted army into the harsh, unforgiving frontiers of Bactria and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, to hunt down the usurper Bessus. The narrative of the war shifted dramatically from set-piece battles on open plains to a brutal, grinding counterinsurgency campaign against elusive warlords who struck from mountain strongholds and vanished into the wilderness. It was a war of ambushes, massacres, and shifting loyalties that tested Alexander's adaptability and the patience of his men to their breaking point. He fought against the talented warlord Spitamines and had to capture the impregnable Sogdian Rock, using flying soldiers volunteers who scaled the sheer cliffs at night using tent pegs and flax ropes in an attempt to quell the resistance and secure his northern border. Alexander made a move that shocked his generals. He married Roxana, the daughter of a local Bactrian chieftain. While romantics paint this as a love match, it was a masterstroke of political pragmatism intended to pacify the region. However, the stress of this guerrilla war began to fracture Alexander's psyche. It was during this period that the tragedy of Cletus the Black occurred. In a drunken argument, Cletus, the man who had saved Alexander's life at Granicus, mocked the king's Persian ways and minimized his achievements compared to Philip. In a fit of blind rage, Alexander snatched a spear and ran his friend through the heart. The instant regret was crushing. Alexander tried to kill himself and wept for days. But the deed was done. The murder of Cletus marked the point of no return. Alexander was no longer just a king. He was a terrified, isolated autocrat who feared his own men as much as the enemy. Monsters of the east awaited them across the river, crossing the Hindu Kush and descending into the Punjab region of India in 326 BC. Alexander faced his most formidable tactical challenge. Yet at the Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus, a ruler of immense stature, legend says he was over 7 feet tall and courage, Porus deployed a terrifying wall of 200 war elephants, beasts the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. These living tanks smelled of musk and fear, panicking the Macedonian horses and threatening to trample the infantry into dust. The two armies faced each other across the swollen Hydaspes River, with Porus mirroring every move Alexander made. Under the cover of a stormy monsoon night, amidst thunder and torrential rain, Alexander executed a daring river crossing miles upstream to flank Porus's army. The ensuing battle was a bloody, chaotic nightmare where men fought amidst the mud, rain, and the trumpeting of wounded elephants. The Macedonians had to use axes to slash at the elephants' trunks and hamstrings to bring them down, while the elephants tossed men in the air and trampled them. It was Alexander's bloodiest masterpiece, and his beloved horse Bucephalus died shortly after the battle, likely from old age and exhaustion, leading Alexander to found a city named Bucephala in his honor. Yet, Alexander's respect for Porus's bravery led to one of his most chivalrous acts. When asked how he wished to be treated after his defeat, the wounded Porus replied, "Treat me as a king." Alexander, impressed by this dignity, not only spared him but reinstated him as a satrap and granted him more territory. This marked a significant evolution in Alexander's mindset from a pure conqueror of destruction to an imperial administrator who recognized the value of incorporating local strength into his vast, multi-ethnic empire. Undefeated by enemies, he was finally stopped by the collective will of his own men. At the Hyphasis River, looking out toward the Gangetic Plain where rumors spoke of even mightier empires, like the Nanda and thousands more war elephants, the Macedonian army broke. They were physically shattered by 8 years of constant marching, covering nearly 20,000 kilometers, and mentally exhausted by the endless monsoon rains and the prospect of fighting monsters. At the edge of the world, for the first time, Alexander's charisma failed him. He sulked in his tent, like Achilles, refusing to come out, hoping to shame them into obedience. He threatened to go on, alone, but the silence from the camp was deafening. Finally, the veteran Coenus spoke for the troops, pleading with him to return home to see their parents before they died. Forced to accept the one defeat he could not fight the limits of human endurance, Alexander turned back, erecting 12 massive altars to mark the limit of his empire. But the return journey became a horror story of its own. Instead of taking the easy route, Alexander, perhaps out of spite or a desire to outdo mythical heroes like Cyrus and Semiramis, who had failed to cross it, decided to march his army through the Jadrasian desert. This logistical catastrophe was a march of Death, the heat was blistering, water was non-existent, and flash floods swept away women and children following the camp. The soldiers were forced to butcher their pack animals and drink their blood to survive. The desert march cost more lives through starvation, dehydration, and heat stroke than all of his battles combined. It was a tragic and perhaps unnecessary price paid for his wounded pride and relentless ambition, leaving a trail of bleached bones in the shifting sands as a grim monument to his ego. Can you merge two warring worlds with a wedding vow? Back in the heart of Persia at Susa in 324 BC, Alexander attempted a radical social experiment designed to unify the Greek and Persian halves of his empire into a single ruling class. He realized that a small Macedonian elite could not rule such a vast Asian empire forever without integration. In a mass ceremony that was as much a theatrical production as a political maneuver, Alexander married to Persian princesses Statera, daughter of Darius, and Parricide, daughter of Artaxerxes, while 80 of his senior officers and 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian women in a singular colossal event. He gave generous dowries to all, envisioning a new race of successors, children of mixed blood who would be loyal only to the empire he had built, free from the old prejudices of Europe and Asia. However, this grand vision of cultural fusion sparked immense backlash. His loyal generals and the rank-and-file Macedonians felt their heritage was being erased, and that they were being replaced by the very people they had defeated. This tension culminated in the mutiny at Apis, where Alexander announced he was sending older veterans home. The soldiers, feeling discarded and jealous of the Persian Epigoni inheritors being trained in Macedonian tactics, revolted. Alexander, in a furious speech, reminded them of how far he had brought them from being shepherds in leather skins on the hills of Macedonia to masters of the world, possessing the gold of the East. He then secluded himself, replacing his Macedonian guard with Persians, until his men broke down, weeping and begging for forgiveness. It was a reconciliation, marked by a prayer for harmony homonoia, but the underlying cracks in his unified empire were beginning to show. To the strongest, with 3 cryptic words whispered on his deathbed, he doomed his empire to a century of fire and blood. While planning a new invasion of Arabia to control the trade routes, Alexander fell suddenly and violently ill in Babylon. After a bout of heavy drinking at a party hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He was racked with fever and eventually unable to speak, his body perhaps weakened by malaria, typhoid, poison, or the cumulative toll of countless wounds and exhausting campaigns. As the fever consumed the man who had consumed the world, his soldiers filed past his bed in a tearful procession, saying goodbye to their god-king who was withering away before their eyes. When his generals gathered around him, desperate to know who would inherit the colossus he had built, he reportedly whispered, "Critisto to the strongest." He handed his signet ring to Perdiccas and breathed his last at the age of 32, on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He left no capable heir. His son Alexander IV was not yet born, and the vacuum of power was instantaneous and catastrophic. The unity he had forged with the sword was shattered by the sword, as his generals, the Diadochi successors, immediately turned on one another. They fought the wars of the Diadochi for 40 years, carving up the map into warring kingdoms like Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Empire. We recount the ominous final days that transformed a unified empire into a battleground, leaving a legacy that was not a single dynasty, but a Hellenistic world born from the chaos of his passing, a world forever changed culturally and politically by the brief blinding flash of his life.